Seth Ellsworth rode into the territory of New Mexico in the spring of 1883 with a deed map worn soft at the folds, a horse named Cannonball who was getting on in years, and a particular kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was the hunger of a man who had spent a decade watching other men stake their claims, build their fences, and plant their roots while he kept moving, kept searching, kept telling himself that the right piece of land was always just a little further west, always just past the next ridge, always somewhere he hadn't yet been. 10 years. That was how long Seth had been looking, and he would be the first to admit that a reasonable man would have stopped long before now. He was 32 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors become weathered, with lines around his eyes that came not from age alone but from squinting into sun and wind, and the particular brand of hope that never quite dies no matter how many times it ought to. He had brown hair the color of creek mud in summer, and eyes that were a complicated shade somewhere between green and gray, and hands that were calloused from years of ranch work done for other men on other men's land. He had saved his wages carefully, lived frugally, turned down comforts he could have afforded, all with the singular purpose of one day owning the ground beneath his feet. The map had come from a land agent in Santa Fe named Beaumont, a small round man with ink-stained fingers who had spread it across his desk, with the reverence of someone presenting a religious document. There was a valley, Beaumont had said, south of the Sangre de Cristo foothills and east of the Rio Grande, fed by a tributary creek that ran clean and cold even in July, with grass so thick in spring that a man's boots disappeared to the ankle. The soil was dark and rich. The elevation was perfect for cattle. There was shelter from the north wind provided by a natural ridge of red stone that curved around the northwestern edge like a cupped hand. The parcel was 320 acres, and it had been available for the better part of 2 years, and the price was something Seth could actually manage if he committed every coin he had saved. Beaumont had looked at him across the desk with the practiced neutrality of a man who sold land for a living and tried not to form attachments to outcomes. "There is one thing I should mention," he had said, and then paused in that way that men pause when the thing they are about to mention is the most important thing. "Say it," Seth had said. "There is a woman on the property." Seth had waited. "She has been there for approximately 14 months, Beaumont continued, folding his hands on top of the map. "She arrived with a husband, a man named Douglas Bell, who had filed a competing claim through a different land office. The claim was disputed because it relied on a survey that turned out to be fraudulent. The survey office in question had been run by a man who is now in prison for precisely that kind of fraud. Douglas Bell's claim was voided 8 months ago. Douglas Bell himself died of a fever 6 months ago." Beaumont cleared his throat. "The woman, Martha Bell, has remained on the property. She has made certain improvements. She has planted a garden and keeps a milk cow and 3 goats. She has, by all accounts, refused to leave." "Refused to leave," Seth repeated slowly. "She maintains that the voiding of her husband's claim was unjust, that the survey was accurate regardless of the surveyor's other conduct, and that she has established sufficient residence and improvement to constitute a valid homestead claim under the Homestead Act." Beaumont spread his hands. "She is, of course, incorrect in this interpretation, as the residency period under the Act requires 5 years and she has been there only 14 months, but she is persistent." Seth had looked at the map for a long time. He had looked at the curve of the creek marked in faded blue ink, and the contour lines that suggested the ridge, and the careful notation of the acreage, and he had thought about 10 years of searching, and about the money he had saved, and about the particular feeling he got in his chest when he looked at a good piece of land the same way other men got that feeling looking at other things. "I'll ride out and see it," he had said. That conversation had happened 3 days ago. Now Seth was riding down the last slope before the valley opened up before him, and he pulled Cannonball to a stop at the crest of the ridge and sat very still in the saddle for a long moment. The valley was everything Beaumont had described and more. The grass was coming in thick and green in the April warmth, rippling in the light wind like the surface of a shallow lake. The creek he could hear before he could see it, a bright liquid sound that carried up the slope. The red stone ridge curved exactly as the map had suggested, catching the afternoon light and throwing it back warm and amber. The sky above was that particular shade of New Mexico blue that painters tried to capture and never quite could, deep and clear and going on forever. And in the middle of it, set back from the creek perhaps 200 yards and positioned to catch both the morning sun and the afternoon shade of a stand of cottonwoods, was a small house. It was modest, but it was not temporary. Someone had built it to stay. The logs were chinked properly. The roof was sod and appeared sound. There was a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose into the still air. There was a garden plot alongside the house, already showing the early green of spring planting. There was a small corral with a brown milk cow and 3 white goats as advertised. There was a clothesline strung between 2 cottonwood trunks, and on it hung a dress and 2 shirts and what appeared to be a curtain, all of them moving gently in the breeze. And there in the garden, on her knees in the dark earth, was a woman. Seth could not make out her features from this distance, but he could see that she was wearing a blue calico dress and a wide-brimmed hat, and that she was working the soil with a hoe with the focused economy of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had no intention of stopping on account of anything as inconsequential as a stranger appearing on the ridge above them. He rode down. She heard him coming when he was perhaps 50 yards out, and she stood up from the garden and turned to face him. And Seth had the immediate and somewhat disorienting experience of finding that the woman he had come here to remove from his property was considerably younger and considerably more striking than he had imagined during 3 days of riding. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that was pinned up under her hat, but had escaped in the way hair does when a person has been working hard and not thinking about it. She had a strong face, not conventionally pretty in the way of town girls, but the kind of face that belonged exactly where it was, outdoors and working, with dark eyes that looked at him without flinching, and a set to her mouth that told him immediately that Beaumont's description of her as persistent had been a significant understatement. She was holding the hoe in both hands, not in a threatening way, but in the way of someone who simply had not put it down yet and saw no reason to. "You must be the man from Santa Fe," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, with a slight accent that he placed as somewhere in the middle of the country, Ohio or Indiana perhaps, a long way from New Mexico. "Seth Ellsworth," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He stopped Cannonball at the edge of the garden. "I take it Beaumont sent word ahead." "He did," Martha Bell said. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, assessing him the way a person assesses a situation they intend to manage. "He said you had papers." "I do." "Then you had better come inside and show them to me," she said, and turned and walked toward the house. And Seth sat on his horse for a moment looking after her, and then dismounted and tied Cannonball to the corral fence and followed her. The inside of the house was small, but it was cared for. There was a table and 2 chairs and a cast iron stove and a shelf of provisions, and a narrow bed in the corner with a quilt that had been made with care, its pattern a series of interlocking rings in blue and white. On the table was an oil lamp, and beside the lamp was a Bible and a tin cup and a small stack of papers. On the windowsill there was one window. With real glass in it was a single tin can containing 3 early wildflowers, purple ones that Seth could not name. Martha Bell set her hoe by the door and removed her hat and hung it on a nail, and Seth saw that her dark hair was indeed quite something when the hat came off, though she paid it no attention whatsoever. She sat down at the table and folded her hands on top of it and looked at him. "Sit," she said. He sat. "Show me your papers." He showed her his papers. She read them carefully and without hurry, and he watched her face as she read them, and her face showed nothing except concentration. When she finished, she set them on the table and looked at them for a moment and then looked at him. "These appear to be in order," she said. They are. I expected they might be, she said. Beaumont is thorough, whatever else he is. She paused. I want you to understand something, Mr. Ellsworth. Seth, he said automatically. She looked at him. Mr. Ellsworth, she repeated with a kind of careful deliberateness. I want you to understand that I am not disputing the legal validity of your documents. I am disputing the justice of the situation that produced them. Seth looked at her. That's a distinction that doesn't change a great deal on a practical level. It changes what kind of person I am, Martha Bell said, and what I am willing to do. And what is it you're willing to do? I am willing to remain on this property and continue improving it and filing my own homestead claim and allowing the courts to sort out which of us has the stronger right to it. She said this very calmly, as if it were a perfectly reasonable proposition, which Seth supposed from her point of view it was. The courts will not find in your favor, he said. Beaumont has already explained the timeline issue with the Homestead Act. Beaumont, Martha said, is a man who sells land and therefore has a financial interest in your position over mine. I intend to consult a lawyer. She met his eyes. I am not a foolish woman, Mr. Ellsworth. I know that the odds are against me, but this is my home. I built it. I improved it. I planted that garden. I carried those logs. My husband died on this land, and I buried him at the edge of the cottonwoods where he asked to be buried because he said it was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. She paused very briefly. I am not going to simply pack my things and ride away because a man with papers has arrived. Seth sat with that for a moment. He thought about 10 years of looking. He thought about all the land he had seen and rejected, the places that were almost right but not quite, the parcels that were fine but not what he was looking for. He thought about riding down that slope 20 minutes ago and seeing this valley and feeling in his chest that particular feeling, that specific rightness, and knowing after a decade that this was the place. He also thought about the quilt on the bed with its interlocking rings, and the wildflowers on the windowsill, and the straight rows of the garden outside, and a woman burying her husband at the edge of the cottonwoods. I'm not going to throw you out, he said. Martha looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has prepared themselves for an argument and is slightly thrown by not getting one. I didn't say I was leaving either, Seth continued. There's enough work on this property for 10 men. I'll camp outside and start working the land. You keep your garden and your animals. We'll figure the rest of it out. That is not a plan, Martha said. That is a delay. Maybe, Seth said, but it's what I have right now. There was a silence. Outside, one of the goats made a sound. There is a lean-to on the south side of the barn, Martha said finally. It's dry. You can put your horse in the corral. I will not cook for you. I can cook for myself, Seth said. Good, said Martha Bell, and stood up and took her hoe from by the door and went back out to her garden. And Seth sat at the table for a moment and looked at his papers, and then looked out the window at the valley that was lit gold in the late afternoon light, and thought that this was going to be considerably more complicated than he had planned. The first week was a careful negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Seth established himself in the lean-to, which was indeed dry and reasonably comfortable once he had laid down his bedroll and hung his gear. He cooked his own meals at a fire outside, ate them alone, and spent his days doing what needed to be done on the property, because there was an enormous amount that needed to be done, and he was constitutionally incapable of seeing work that needed doing and not doing it. The corral fence needed 2 new rails on the east side. He cut them from a dead fall cottonwood and fitted them and said nothing about it. The barn roof, a proper small barn that Martha had apparently either built or had built since arriving, had a section of deteriorating thatch that needed replacement. He redid it. The creek had a log jammed across it about a quarter-mile upstream that was causing the water to pool and eddy rather than flowing cleanly through the property. He spent an entire afternoon with a rope and cannonball working that log loose, and when it came free, the creek straightened and quickened and ran clean and bright and fast past the edge of the garden. He watched Martha work. He tried not to make it obvious that he was watching, But there was not a great deal in the valley to look at that wasn't Martha, and she worked from first light until the sun was well past the middle of the sky, and she was very good at everything she did. She knew her animals. She knew her garden. She moved through the landscape with the assurance of someone who had paid attention and learned, not the assurance of someone born to it, which told him that she had taught herself, which was harder. On the fourth morning he found her standing at the corral fence looking at Cannonball with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He's a good horse," Seth said, coming up beside her. He leaned on the fence. "Getting old now. He's earned his rest." "He has kind eyes," Martha said. This was the most personal thing she had said to him since the first day. Seth considered it. "He does," he agreed. A pause. "The creek is running better," Martha said. "I noticed. That log had been in there a while." "It had," she said. "I tried to move it myself when the water started pooling, couldn't manage it." "It took me and Cannonball both most of an afternoon," Seth said. "Nothing wrong with not being able to move it alone." Martha turned and looked at him, and he saw something shift slightly in those dark eyes, not warmth exactly, but a reduction of the careful distance she had been maintaining. "I am going to make cornbread this evening," she said. "I made too much batter. You are welcome to some, if you want it." "I'd be grateful," Seth said, and meant it, and she nodded once and went back to her animals. And Seth stood at the fence for a moment and looked at the valley in the morning light and breathed in the smell of it. The grass and the creek water and the particular clean, cold smell of New Mexico in April, and felt something settle in him like a stone finding the bottom of still water. The cornbread was excellent. She left a covered plate on the fence post nearest the lean-to, and he ate it sitting outside watching the stars come out. And they were extraordinary stars, the kind of stars you only see in places far from towns, thick and bright and closer than they had any right to be. He thought about the fact that Martha Bell watched these stars every night alone, and had been watching them alone since her husband died, and felt something that was adjacent to sadness but not quite it. By the end of the second week, they were eating supper together most evenings. It had happened gradually, without either of them acknowledging that it was happening. The way things happen in close quarters when two people both have enough intelligence and enough basic decency to recognize that hostility takes more energy than it is worth. Martha cooked in the evenings. She was a considerably better cook than Seth, and he brought in the wood and filled the water bucket from the creek, and they sat at her table and ate and talked about practical things, the state of the soil, what the weather seemed to be doing, which sections of fence needed attention. Then one evening she asked him where he was from. He told her. Born in Missouri, moved to Kansas with his family when he was 12, worked his father's land until he was 20 and the farm went under in a drought, and his father sold what was left and went to work on the railroad, and his mother went to live with her sister in St. Louis. Seth had gone west. He had worked on 4 different cattle ranches over 10 years, learned everything there was to know about land and cattle and the business of running a working operation, and saved his money and looked. "Why New Mexico?" she asked. "I came through once about 6 years ago on a drive," he said. "Something about the light, the way the air feels. I don't know how to explain it better than that." She looked at the window, which was dark now with evening. "I think I understand that," she said. "Douglas wanted to go to California. He had an uncle there. But we stopped here for a week while his horse was lame, and I walked out one morning and stood in that meadow by the creek and looked at the mountains and thought, this is it. This is the place." She was quiet for a moment. "He stayed for me." Seth looked at his hands around his coffee cup. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Martha said simply. "He was not a strong man in some ways. He trusted people he should not have trusted, which is how we ended up with a fraudulent survey. But he worked hard and he was kind and he tried." She paused. "The fever came on fast. There was nothing to be done. I rode to the nearest town for a doctor, and by the time I came back with one it was over." Seth had no answer for that was worth saying. He sat with the weight of it for a moment, and Martha seemed to understand that he was doing that, and was content to sit with it herself, and the silence between them that night had a quality he would later think of as the first real moment of understanding between them, the first time the silence was comfortable rather than wary. The trouble started in the third week, which is to say that the trouble had been building for much longer than that, and simply arrived in the third week in the form of two men on horses who came down the slope from the north one morning, while Seth was working on the fence line and Martha was in the garden. They were the kind of men who looked like trouble because they were trouble, which was a skill Seth had developed over 10 years of working ranges where trouble was common. They were both well-armed and not particularly clean, and they rode with the loose-limbed ease of men who had been in the saddle a very long time, and they came straight across the valley floor without any of the polite circling that a person approaching a homestead normally does, which told Seth a great deal about their intentions before they had said a word. He set down his post driver and walked toward the house at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful. "Mrs. Bell," he said, passing close by the garden. Martha straightened from her work and looked at the two riders, and her expression went flat and careful. "I see them," she said quietly. "You know them. The big one is named Cord Haverson," she said, her voice barely above conversational. "He works for a ranching operation south of here, a man named Ashworth who has been wanting this valley for 2 years. He came to speak to Douglas about buying us out once. Douglas refused. Haverson came back after Douglas died and offered me a price that was insultingly low and told me it would be in my best interest to take it. And the other one, I don't know him." Seth positioned himself between the house and the approaching riders, not aggressively, but in the way of a man who has a right to stand where he is standing. Martha came and stood a little behind and to his left, and she had, he noticed, the hoe in her hands again. Haverson pulled up about 10 feet away. He was a large man with a reddish face and pale eyes and the kind of mustache that men grow when they want to look authoritative. He looked at Seth with an expression that combined surprise with calculation. "Didn't know the widow had company," he said. He said widow in a way that was not sympathetic. "She's not alone," Seth said. Haverson studied him. "Who are you?" "Seth Ellsworth. I hold title to this property." Haverson's pale eyes moved between Seth and Martha and back, working something out. "Beaumont's buyer," he said finally. "Yes." "Then you'll know the sensible business here is to sell to Ashworth," Haverson said, as if this were a conclusion that followed logically from basic mathematics. "He's offered fair market value and then some. The operation he runs needs this water access. It only makes sense." "If Mr. Ashworth wants to make an offer," Seth said, "he's welcome to do it in writing through a proper channel. If the offer is good enough, I'll consider it. But that's a conversation for another time and a different setting." Haverson looked at him for a moment, reassessing. Then he looked at Martha. "Thought maybe without the husband you might have changed your mind," he said to her. "Ashworth's offer still stands. It's more than you'll clear in 5 years of working this ground yourself." "I'm aware of Mr. Ashworth's offer," Martha said, with a steadiness in her voice that Seth found remarkable. "My answer remains what it was." Haverson looked at his companion, who had said nothing throughout this exchange, and then looked back at Seth with those pale, calculating eyes. "I'll tell Ashworth you're considering it," he said, which was not what Seth had said at all, and then he turned his horse and the two of them rode back the way they had come, and Seth watched them go until they crested the northern ridge and disappeared. He turned to look at Martha. She was watching the ridge with an expression that was composed but under which he could see very clearly that she was frightened, and that she was not going to admit to being frightened, and that the combination of those two things had been the basic texture of her life for the past several months. "This has happened before," Seth said. It was not a question. "Haverson comes about once a month," she said. "He hasn't done anything yet. He mostly talks." "Yet," Seth said. Martha set the hoe against the fence post. "Yet," she agreed. That evening they sat at the table after supper and Seth spread his deed map between them and they talked for the first time about the land not as a point of contention between them but as a shared problem. Martha had a copy of her husband's claim papers, the voided ones, and she spread them alongside Seth's documents, and they looked at them together, and the picture that emerged was complicated but not incomprehensible. Beaumont, Seth said, had been honest with him about the dispute. The fraudulent survey was a real issue, but Martha's point about the quality of the survey itself had some merit. The survey had been accurate as far as could be determined, regardless of the surveyor's other crimes. The voiding of the claim on those grounds seemed at minimum arguable. "I spoke to a lawyer in Las Cruces by letter," Martha said. She got up and found a folded letter from the Bible on the shelf and brought it back to the table. "His name is Howard Clegg. He wrote back 3 weeks ago." Seth read the letter. It was carefully written and not entirely discouraging. Clegg agreed that the voiding of the Bell claim was legally sound but potentially challengeable if Martha could demonstrate that the survey itself was accurate independent of the surveyor's credibility. The challenge would require time and money and was not guaranteed to succeed. "What did you write back?" Seth asked. "I haven't written back yet," Martha said. "I was going to tell him I couldn't afford his fees." She said this without self-pity, as a plain statement of facts. Seth looked at the map and then at the letter and then at Martha, who was looking at the lamp with an expression he was beginning to be able to read, the particular expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something she was not quite ready to say. "I have an idea," he said carefully. She looked at him. "The Homestead Act requires 5 years residence and continuous improvement," he said. "You've been here 14 months. That leaves 3 years and 10 months, even if we set aside the question of the voided claim. And the voided claim is a separate fight that could take years and cost more than this land is worth." "I know," she said. "But there is another option," Seth said, and then stopped, because he was aware that what he was about to say was something that required more trust than they had yet established, and he was not certain how to say it without it sounding like something other than what it was. "Say it," Martha said, in an inadvertent echo of what he himself had said to Beaumont in Santa Fe, and something about the echo made him meet her eyes and speak directly. "I hold clear title to this land. If we married, you would have a legal stake in it as my wife. The Haverson problem would be more manageable with 2 people than 1. The work is more than 1 person can do well. And you clearly love this place and know it better than I do." He held her gaze. "I am not suggesting this as a romantic proposal. I am suggesting it as a practical solution to a situation that is not good for either of us separately." Martha Bell looked at him for a very long moment. "I have been a widow for 6 months," she said. "I know. I barely know you. I know that too." "And you are suggesting this as a practical matter," she said, with a slight particular emphasis on practical that he could not entirely interpret. "Yes," Seth said, "though I want to be clear that I am not unaware that it would be more than a practical matter. And I would not make that kind of proposal to a woman I did not think well of." Martha looked at her folded hands on the table. "I need time to think about it," she said. "Of course," she looked up. "But I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I do not dislike you, Mr. Ellsworth. That matters under the circumstances." "It does," Seth said, "and I don't dislike you either." The corner of her mouth moved, almost but not quite becoming a smile. "High praise," she said dryly, and stood and cleared the plates, and Seth sat and looked at the valley through the dark window and thought that whatever happened next, something had changed. She gave him her answer 4 days later, on a Sunday morning, when they had both independently, and without discussion, ended up sitting on the bank of the creek in the early morning watching the water go by, which had become a kind of habit neither of them had named. The creek was particularly beautiful that morning, running clear and fast over the small rocks, with the cottonwoods just fully leafed out above them and the light coming through in pieces. "I have been thinking about what you said," Martha said without preamble. "I figured you had." "I have a condition," she said. Seth looked at her. "All right. We do this honestly," she said. "We do not pretend it is only a practical matter if it becomes more than that. We do not hide behind practicality as an excuse to avoid the rest of it." She looked at the creek. "I was married to a man I loved, and it was good, and I know what the good version looks like. I am not interested in a lesser version. If this is going to be a real marriage, it should be a real marriage. If it is only going to be a business arrangement, then I would rather find another way." Seth sat with that. He looked at the creek and the light through the cottonwoods and thought about what she had said, and about the 4 days he had spent thinking about his own proposal, and about the fact that he had thought about it considerably more than a purely practical consideration would require. "I think," he said slowly, "that I made that proposal for more reasons than I admitted to either of us." Martha turned her head and looked at him. "I think I am capable of the real version," he said. "I don't know yet. I've been moving too long to be certain what I'm capable of when I stop, but I think so." Martha Bell looked at him for a long moment with those dark, intelligent eyes, and whatever she saw there satisfied her because she nodded once. "Then yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Seth Ellsworth." He had been Seth to her for the first time, he noticed, and said nothing about it, but it settled in him warm and quiet. They rode to Cimarron to find a justice of the peace, which took most of a day, and Seth spent the morning of the ride thinking about the fact that he was getting married and trying to determine whether the feeling in his chest was anxiety or something else, and gradually understanding that it was something else. Martha rode alongside him on a small sorrel mare named Daisy, who was, Martha had informed him, entirely her own property and not subject to any deed disputes whatsoever, and she had said this with the slight dry humor he was learning to listen for in her. The justice of the peace was a man named Everett Moore, who operated out of a room behind the general store, and he seemed neither surprised nor particularly interested in performing the ceremony, which Seth supposed was the occupational hazard of being a justice of the peace in a territory where people frequently needed to make things legal without ceremony. He asked if they had witnesses, and Seth went into the general store and came back with the proprietor, a Mrs. Garcia, and her husband, both of whom were happy to serve, and seemed considerably more interested in the proceedings than Moore himself. It was a short ceremony. Moore read the words in a flat, businesslike tone, and Seth and Martha said what was required of them, and Moore declared them married and had them sign the register, and Mrs. Garcia said something in Spanish that Seth didn't catch all of but which sounded warm and meant well, and then it was done. Outside on the board sidewalk of Cimarron in the May afternoon sun, Seth and Martha Bell Ellsworth stood for a moment looking at the street and the buildings and the mountains in the distance, and Seth thought about what to say. "Well," he said. "Well," Martha agreed. "Are you hungry? We could eat before we ride back." She looked at him, and there was something in her face that was nearly amusement and nearly something more serious. "I am," she said. "Let's eat." They ate at a small establishment that served beans and salt pork and good bread, and they talked over supper as they had been talking for weeks, about the land and the plans and the coming summer and what needed to be done, and it was comfortable and easy and felt, Seth thought, remarkably natural for two people who had been strangers a month ago. But there was also something new underneath the practicality, something that had been named by the words spoken in Moore's office and could not be unnamed, and it surfaced occasionally in the way she would look up from her plate and find him already looking at her, or in the moment when their hands were close to each other on the table and neither of them moved them away. When they rode home in the long evening light, the valley came into view below them, and it was magnificent, as it always was in the evening, gold and green and red stone and the silver thread of the creek, and Seth pulled Cannonball to a stop at the top of the ridge as he had that first day. "It's something," he said. "It is," Martha said beside him, and she was looking at it with an expression that was also something, though he was not yet certain which thing. He realized, stopped looking, not just for the land, though he had found the land. He had stopped the other kind of looking too, the scanning forward and outward, the permanent displacement forward in time and space that had been the condition of his life for a decade. He was here. He was looking at here. And beside him was the reason he was doing so, though he was not yet ready to say that, not yet, because it was very new and she had been a widow for 6 months and there was time. There was, for the first time in 10 years' time. The summer came in hard and bright and full of work, and there was too much work for two people on 320 acres in a way that was energizing rather than defeating, because the work was their own work on their own land, and that made all the difference. Seth was up before dawn every morning and working until the light gave out in the evenings, and so was Martha, and they fell into a rhythm together that was efficient and comfortable and occasionally punctuated by the kind of small argument that comes not from animosity, but from two opinionated people both having strong ideas about how things should be done. The first real argument was about the cattle. Seth had money enough for a small herd, 12 or 15 head of breeding stock, and had found a rancher in the county willing to sell at a fair price. Martha thought they should wait until the following spring and spend the summer improving the infrastructure, specifically the barn and the fence lines, before introducing animals that would require constant attention. "We have the cow and the goats already," Seth pointed out. "Which is why I know how much attention animals require," Martha said. They argued about it over breakfast on a Tuesday in June, the kind of argument that is also a mutual negotiation, and they reached a compromise that was genuinely a compromise, as in both of them got part of what they wanted and neither got all of it. Seth would acquire 8 head of breeding stock, not 15, and they would spend the first half of the summer repairing the barn and strengthening the fence lines before bringing the cattle in. Martha would not say she was satisfied with this outcome because she did not think it was fully correct, and Seth would not pretend he hadn't wanted more cattle than 8, but they shook hands on it at the table in the way of people who have learned that doing things together requires more negotiation and less unilateral action than doing things alone. He noticed, shaking her hand, that it was the first time he had held her hand, and that it was a capable hand, strong and warm. The fence lines were extensive, and the work was hot. Seth spent the days in July at it, setting new posts and stretching wire, with the sun beating down and the mountains shimmering in the distance, and the creek providing the only reliable relief, because he discovered early on that you could work along the fence line until the heat became unreasonable, and then walk into the creek with your boots on, and stand there in water that was cold enough to take your breath away even on the hottest afternoon, and come out feeling like a different and better person. He came back one afternoon to find Martha in the creek as well, standing in water up to her knees in her rolled-up dress, with her feet white and pale in the brown creek bed, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and there was a moment of pure unself-consciousness between them. The way there is when two people have been living closely enough that the careful, formal distance has worn away without either of them noticing. "There's room," she said, gesturing at the creek, and he sat on the bank and pulled off his boots and waded in beside her, and they stood there in the cold water for a while not saying much, and the mountains were blue in the distance and the sky was the deep New Mexico blue and the cottonwoods were green and heavy, and it was, Seth thought, about as good a moment as he had had in a very long time. "I want to tell you something," Martha said, looking at the water. "All right. I was afraid, after Douglas died, that I was going to have to give this up," she said. "Not afraid in a way I could tell anyone about. Just this quiet, constant fear underneath everything I did. Because this was ours, mine and his, and without him it was mine alone, and I was not at all certain I could keep it alone." She looked up at the mountains. "And then you came, which was supposed to make things worse, and it did for about a week, and then it did not." Seth looked at her profile against the mountains. "I'm glad it didn't," he said. "I'm glad too," she said quietly, and they stood in the cold water for a while longer, and Seth thought about what she'd said, and about the fact that it had taken considerable courage to say it, and he thought about what would be the honest and right response to that courage. "When I rode down that slope and saw you in the garden," he said carefully, "I was annoyed. I had spent 10 years looking for this land, and there was a woman on it who would not leave, and I was annoyed." The corner of her mouth moved. "And then I met you," he said, "and I was less annoyed and considerably more interested in you as a person, and that feeling has been growing for the past 3 months in a way that I should probably name at some point." Martha turned her head and looked at him, and her dark eyes were direct and level, and held something in them he recognized because he had felt it in himself. "It does probably need a name," she said. "I love you," Seth said, because there was no better word for it, and the simpler he said it, the more honest it would be. "I have been in this valley 3 months, and I love you, and I love this land, and I cannot at this point fully separate those two things, and I want you to know that." Martha Bell Ellsworth looked at him in the cold creek water with the mountains behind her and said, "I love you too, Seth," in a voice that was quiet and clear and entirely certain. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on in the uncomplicated way of a person who has been holding everything together alone for a long time and has finally found someone they trust to hold it with them. He held her back. The creek ran around their feet, and the cottonwoods made their rushing sound in the afternoon wind, and the mountains watched from their blue distance, and it was as good a moment as Seth Ellsworth had ever had in his life. The Haverson problem returned in August. It returned in a more serious form than before, which Seth had been expecting ever since Haverson's first visit and had been quietly preparing for. He had made a point of getting to know the neighbors, which in this part of New Mexico meant riding considerable distances, but there were 3 other homestead families within 10 miles, and a small ranching operation run by a family named Chavez whose patriarch, a man named Roberto Chavez, was the most knowledgeable person Seth had encountered about the local land and water politics. Roberto Chavez was 60 years old and had been on his land for 30 years, which meant he had seen everything, and what he told Seth about Ashworth was not comforting. Ashworth ran about 400 head of cattle on grazing land south and east of the valley, and he needed the creek water for dry season grazing, and he had been trying to acquire the Bell parcel for 2 years by means that ranged from legitimate offers to the kind of pressure that Haverson represented. He was not a violent man, Roberto said carefully, but Haverson was, and Ashworth was the kind of man who preferred not to know the details of how his interests were served. "What does he actually want?" Seth asked. "The creek," Roberto said simply. "He can run twice the cattle if he has reliable water in August and September. Your creek runs clean through September. Most in this area are down to a trickle by then." "He could put in a water tank," Seth said. "He could," Roberto agreed. "But that costs money. Your creek costs nothing if he owns it." The trouble arrived on a Thursday in August, when Seth came back from working the south fence line to find the gate of the corral standing open and the brown milk cow gone. The goats were still there, which told him the gate had not been opened carelessly, because anyone who knew goats knew they would be through an open gate before you finished opening it. The cow had been specifically removed. Martha was at the creek when he found her, and her face when he told her went through several things in quick succession: alarm and anger, and then a hard, flat resolve. "Haverson," she said, "almost certainly." "That is my cow," she said, with a quietness in her voice that was more frightening than shouting. "I bought that cow with the last of the money Douglas and I brought from Ohio. Her name is Bella and she is mine." Seth looked at the open corral gate and thought about what Roberto Chavez had said about Ashworth preferring not to know details. "I'm going to ride to Ashworth's operation," he said. "I'm coming with you," Martha said. He looked at her. "Martha, she is my cow," Martha said. "I am coming." They rode south, which was into the afternoon sun, and it took them about 2 hours to reach the Ashworth spread, which was considerably larger than Seth had imagined: a main house and a bunkhouse, and several barns and corrals spread across a wide, flat plain. They could see cattle on the hillside in the distance, a considerable number of them. A man came out of the bunkhouse when they rode in, and it was not Haverson. "We're here to see Ashworth," Seth said. The man looked at them with the careful neutrality of an employee who has been around long enough to be wary. "He's not here today." "Then we'll speak to whoever is in charge in his absence," Seth said. "We are here about a cow that was taken from our property this morning. A brown dairy cow, branded MB on the left hip. If she is here, we are taking her home." There was a pause. The man looked at them for a long moment, and then looked away, and Seth followed his gaze to a corral on the far side of the main barn where there were several animals, and among them, clearly visible at this distance because of her distinctive color and her size relative to the beef cattle around her, was a brown dairy cow. Martha was off her horse and walking toward that corral before Seth had fully processed what he was looking at, and he dismounted quickly and followed her. No one stopped them, which he thought meant the man by the bunkhouse had decided this was not his fight to have. Martha went to the corral fence, and the brown cow came to her immediately, pressing her broad forehead against the fence rails, and Martha put her hands on the cow's face and said, "Hello, Bella," in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact, and then she unlatched the corral gate and led the cow out and tied her lead rope to her saddle ring. "You can tell Ashworth," Seth said to the man by the bunkhouse, who was watching all of this with a complicated expression, "that this constitutes theft, and that if it happens again, I will be speaking to the county sheriff in Cimarron. And you can tell Haverson that if he sets foot on my property again, I will send for that sheriff without waiting to see if anything else goes missing first." They rode home with Bella plodding along between them, and Martha was quiet for most of the ride. But it was a different kind of quiet than her usual, charged with something that was working itself out. When they got back and settled Bella in the corral and secured the gate with a new bar Seth cut and fitted that evening, Martha sat on the fence and watched him work, and after a while said, "Thank you." "She's your cow," Seth said, fitting the bar. "I mean for coming with me," Martha said. "For not trying to handle it yourself and coming back and telling me it was taken care of." Seth looked up at her. "It was your fight as much as mine." "More mine in some ways," she said, "and you let it be mine." She paused. "That is not nothing." He went back to fitting the bar. "It's not nothing," he agreed. The Ashworth situation resolved itself more quickly than Seth had anticipated, and it resolved in a way he had not expected but should have, because he had underestimated Roberto Chavez. 2 weeks after the cow incident, Roberto rode up to the Ellsworth property with news. He had spoken to the other homestead families in the area, and they had collectively sent a letter to the county land office in Cimarron documenting Ashworth's pattern of harassment, and the land office had passed the letter to the territorial governor's office, and the territorial governor had sent a letter to Ashworth that was, by Roberto's account, fairly direct. "The governor does not like the attention," Roberto said, sitting on his horse in the Ellsworth yard and drinking the coffee Martha had brought out. "There is talk of a railroad coming through this part of the territory, and the governor wants everything quiet and orderly and settled. Ashworth causing trouble with homesteaders is not quiet and orderly and settled." "Did it work?" Seth asked. "Haverson was let go 2 weeks ago," Roberto said. "Ashworth hired a new man as foreman, a man named Price who has a reputation for being fair. I think the matter is settled." He finished his coffee and handed the cup back to Martha with a small, courteous nod. The governor's letter mentioned water rights specifically. It suggested that Ashworth look into constructing a water tank. When Roberto was gone, Seth looked at Martha and she looked at Seth and she laughed, which was the first time he had heard her genuinely laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was, he thought, a remarkable sound. "A water tank," she said. "A water tank," Seth agreed, and she was still smiling when they went inside, and the smile stayed on her face through supper, and he found himself looking at it when he thought she wasn't noticing, which she probably was. September brought the dry weather and the clear skies and the extraordinary quality of light that Seth had first encountered in New Mexico 6 years earlier on the cattle drive, and that had made him decide, without fully understanding the decision at the time, that this was where he needed to end up. The creek ran clean and strong as Roberto had said it would, considerably better than most water in the county in September, and the 8 cattle they had brought in were fat in content. The lawyer Clegg in Las Cruces had written again, and this time Martha wrote back, and they had entered into a correspondence about the Bell claim that Seth had read and contributed to, and that was gradually building into something that might, in time, produce a result, though Clegg was careful to say that it might also not. Seth had decided that this was worth pursuing not because he needed it to be resolved in any particular way. His title to the land was clear and he was building on it, but because it mattered to Martha, and therefore it mattered. The evenings in September were cool and blue and long, and they sat on the step of the house in the evenings and watched the light change on the mountains and talked. And the conversations now were different from the early careful practical conversations, and different even from the conversations of summer, deeper and wider ranging, and frequently surprising. He learned that Martha had been a schoolteacher in Indiana before she married Douglas. He learned that she had been reading whatever she could find to read since she was 5 years old, and that one of her recurring small griefs about the frontier was the scarcity of books. He learned that she had strong opinions about nearly everything, expressed them with precision and wit, and changed them readily when presented with a sufficiently compelling reason, which was a combination of qualities he found extremely attractive. She learned that he had a younger sister in Kansas City named Clara who wrote him letters every few months. She learned that he had a specific and extensive knowledge of grasses and soil types that bordered on the philosophical. She learned that he was teaching himself to play the harmonica from a book he had bought in Santa Fe, which he was terrible at but persistent about, which she found more endearing than annoying, though only barely. One evening in late September she looked at him across the step and said, "You know this is a real marriage now." He looked at her. "I know. I want to make sure you know," she said, "because you said at the beginning that it was practical and you've been respectful of what I lost and of the time I needed, which I have appreciated enormously." She looked at the mountains. "I have had enough time, Seth." He set down the harmonica. "Good," he said, and he reached across the step and took her hand, and she turned it in his and held on, and the mountains turned purple and gold, and the stars began to appear above the valley, and the creek made its perpetual bright sound in the dark below them. He kissed her that night for the first time, standing in the doorway of the house with the stars visible through the open door behind her, a careful, deliberate kiss that she returned without hesitation, and that tasted like coffee and the beginning of something that had been building since April and was not going to stop now. They were, Seth thought, going to be all right. They were, in fact, going to be more than all right. The fall was golden and busy, and rich in the way that a season is rich when you have worked hard enough to earn it. The cattle were doing well. The garden had produced extravagantly, and they spent several evenings at the table with an enormous amount of produce and a serious discussion about preservation, because Martha knew how to put up vegetables and Seth did not, and she was quietly pleased to be the one teaching something for a change. She taught him how to put up tomatoes and how to preserve dried beans and how to make a decent apple butter from the wild apples that grew along the creek bank, which he had not known were there until she showed him, and he spent 2 days picking them, and she spent 2 evenings turning them into something extraordinary. He wrote to Clara about Martha. He had written to Clara sporadically throughout his years of wandering, short letters that told her he was well and where he was and not much else. And she had written back faithfully with long letters full of news about Kansas City and gentle questions about when he was going to stop moving. He wrote her now a longer letter than usual, telling her about the valley and about Martha, and Clara wrote back by return post that she had never been so relieved to hear anything in her life, and that she intended to visit as soon as the weather made travel sensible, and that she wanted a full account of everything he had neglected to tell her for the past decade. Martha received this news with equanimity and a faint curiosity. She had no siblings of her own, she said, and had always wanted one, so a sister-in-law sounded entirely pleasant. Seth told her that Clara was formidable and she said she would manage. The first snow came in November, a light snow that dusted the ridge and the meadow and turned the valley into something that looked like a painting, white and silver and the red stone glowing dark behind it. Seth and Martha stood at the window watching it come down, and Martha leaned against him in a natural, unself-conscious way, and he put his arm around her. And outside the world was white and quiet, and inside was warm. There was a conversation they had in November that Seth would remember for the rest of his life, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic. She had been at the table writing a letter to Clegg in Las Cruces, and Seth had been mending a harness by the stove, and it was snowing outside, a proper snow now rather than the light dusting of the first one, and the stove was warm and the lamp was lit. "Seth," she said, without looking up from her letter. "I want children," she said. "I want you to know that. I am 27 years old and I want children, and I think this is a good place and a good life to have them in." He set down the harness and looked at her, and she finished writing her sentence and looked up at him. "I want that too," he said, "very much." She held his gaze for a moment with those direct dark eyes and then nodded once, with the manner of someone who has confirmed something important, and went back to her letter. He went back to the harness. Outside, the snow fell steadily over the valley. The winter was long and cold and good, the kind of winter that drives two people deeper into each other's company and into the warmth they make together. They read in the evenings. Seth had taken to ordering books from a bookseller in Santa Fe, 2 or 3 at a time, which delighted Martha in a way that was not entirely about the books, and talked and played cards and argued about things that were not worth arguing about and were comfortable in their arguments. He played the harmonica badly, and she listened with more patience than it deserved, and occasionally picked it up herself, and turned out to have considerable natural aptitude, which was irritating and wonderful in equal measure. The cold eased in February, and by March the creek was running high and fast with snowmelt, and the valley was beginning to show the first green of the coming year. And Seth saddled Cannonball one morning and rode to the top of the ridge, and sat there looking down at the valley and the house, and the smoke rising from the chimney and the garden plot waiting for the season. He thought about 10 years of moving and about what it had led to, and he thought about Martha and the particular grace with which she had rebuilt her life and brought him into the rebuilding of it, and he thought about the future which was, for the first time in his life, a thing he could see clearly in a specific place rather than as an abstract destination somewhere over the next ridge. He rode back down. Martha was in the barn when he came in, checking on the cow and the goats as she did every morning, and she looked up when she heard him, and the morning light through the barn door was behind him, and she was standing in the warm hay-scented dark with a goat leaning against her leg, and she looked exactly right, exactly where she belonged. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and went and kissed her, which made the goat start and move away in offense, and Martha laughed against his mouth and put her hands against his chest. "The goats do not approve," she said. "The goats can manage," he said. Spring came in full and generous and beautiful, and with it came Clara. She arrived on a warm April morning, by stagecoach to Cimarron and then by hired horse the 10 miles south to the valley, and Seth rode out to meet her on the road, and they sat on their horses for a moment looking at each other. And Seth thought that his sister had grown considerably more formidable since he had last seen her 5 years ago. She was 28 now, with Seth's coloring but not his height, sharp and bright-eyed and already looking over his shoulder toward the valley. "Is this it?" she asked. "This is it." She looked at the valley for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said with a kind of simple directness. "All right, I want to meet her." Martha met them at the yard fence, and she and Clara looked at each other with the mutual assessment of two intelligent women meeting for the first time, and Seth stood back and waited, because he could not have said anything useful even if he had known what to say. "He wrote me about you in October," Clara said to Martha. "It was the first letter he has written me in 10 years that told me anything worth knowing." "He told me you were formidable," Martha said. "He was right." Clara looked at her for a moment and then smiled, a real smile, and said, "Good." "I am glad you are here," and came through the gate and embraced Martha with the unself-conscious directness with which Seth was beginning to understand all the Ellsworth family did everything. And Martha returned the embrace with a steadiness that made something ease in Seth's chest. Clara stayed 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks were among the best Seth had known. She was good company and good help, and she and Martha talked with an ease and depth that developed faster than he would have thought possible and was, he discovered, mostly about books and about the nature of life on the frontier, and about Martha's plans for the valley's future, which were extensive and specific, and which Seth had heard most of but not all of, because Clara asked questions that Martha apparently hadn't thought he'd asked yet. "Did you know she wants to start a lending library?" Clara asked him one evening when Martha had gone to check the animals. "I did not know that," Seth said. "She wants to collect books and lend them to the other homestead families in the valley," Clara said. "She says there is nothing children on the frontier lack more than books, and that she was a school teacher and still thinks of it as her work even if she doesn't have a schoolroom." Clara looked at her brother. "You should help her do it." "I intend to," Seth said, "now that I know about it." When Clara left, she embraced Martha for a long time at the gate and said something quiet that Seth didn't hear, and Martha's eyes were bright in a way he had learned to read, and she stood watching Clara's horse until it was out of sight and then came and took Seth's hand and they stood together at the gate. "She told me you have been happier this year than she has known you to be in your adult life," Martha said. "That is true," Seth said. "She told me she was glad it was me," Martha said. He looked at her. "So am I," he said simply. The spring was full of good news. The first letter arrived from Clegg in April containing information that was, cautiously, positive. He had found additional evidence regarding the Bell survey, specifically correspondence between the fraudulent surveyor and the land office that suggested the survey itself had been conducted properly before the surveyor began his later criminal activities. And this evidence was strong enough to at least bring before a judge. He would need more time and his fees remained a consideration, but he believed there was a real case here. Seth and Martha sat with this letter for a long time. "We should fund it," Seth said, "fully, whatever it costs." Martha looked at him. "Seth, that money." "The herd is doing well," he said. "We'll have enough from the cattle sales to cover his fees and still come through the summer comfortable. And even if the case does not succeed, even if the Bell claim cannot be separately established, the money is not wasted, because the pursuit of it is just and just things are worth money." He paused. "And because it matters to you." Martha was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that for me." "I know I don't have to," Seth said. "That's the point." She looked at him across the table and he watched the thing he had learned to look for in her face, the thing she did when she was moved and was deciding how to express it. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over his and held it there. "Write to Clegg," she said. "Tell him to proceed." In June, Martha told him she was going to have a baby. She told him in the morning, in the practical manner she used for important practical things, sitting across the breakfast table and looking at him with that particular steady gaze. "I am going to have a baby," she said. "Likely in January, I think." Seth set down his coffee. He was aware, in the moment, of a kind of fullness in his chest that was not like anything he had felt before, a feeling that was joy and gravity at the same time, the kind of feeling a person has when something large and irreversible and absolutely right has just been confirmed. "January," he said. "That is my best estimate," Martha said, with a slight unsteadiness in her voice that told him she was moved despite herself. He got up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood up, and he held her against him, and she held on. And the morning was coming through the window warm and bright, and the creek was running, and outside the valley was green and gold and full of spring. "A boy," he said against her hair. "I think it's going to be a boy." "You cannot possibly know that," she said. "I have a feeling," he said. "Your feelings," Martha said, "have not always been reliable." "My feeling about this valley was reliable," he pointed out. She pulled back and looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before, open and soft and completely unguarded, and it was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was, she said. All right. A boy. They wrote to Clara immediately, and Clara's return letter arrived with remarkable speed and contained a great deal of exclamation that was unusual for her and made Seth smile every time he thought about it. The summer was different now, colored by the knowledge of what was coming. There was extra work to do in preparation, a second room to add to the house. Seth had been planning to add it anyway, had already cut most of the logs over the winter, and now the motivation was considerably more urgent, and provisions to lay in, and a cradle to build, and 100 small practical things to think about. But underneath all the practicality was a warmth and a brightness that made the work easy, made even the hot days of July and August feel like gifts rather than endurances. He built the room carefully, taking more care than he had taken with any other project on the property, fitting the logs tight and chinking them thoroughly, and building a small window that would catch the morning light. Martha made curtains for it from blue fabric she ordered from the dry goods store in Cimarron, the same shade of blue as her garden dress, and when the room was finished and the curtains were hung, they stood in the doorway and looked at it. "It's good," Martha said. "It'll do," Seth said, which was what he said when something was as good as he knew how to make it. In August, Clegg wrote with significant news. The judge in Las Cruces had agreed to hear the case. It was scheduled for October. Clegg was cautiously optimistic, which from a lawyer meant he thought they had a real chance. In October, Seth rode to Las Cruces with Martha, who was now visibly pregnant and absolutely insisted on making the trip because this was her case and she intended to be present. Seth had not argued, because he had learned that arguing with Martha when she had made up her mind was a poor investment of energy, and because he respected her too much to try. The courthouse in Las Cruces was a stone building that smelled of dust and old wood and the particular gravity of legal proceedings, and the judge was a man named Harwood who looked at the evidence Clegg presented with careful attention and asked sharp questions and said very little. The proceedings took 2 days, and on the second afternoon the judge read a short decision. The Bell claim, Harwood said, had indeed been improperly voided. The survey had been conducted with professional accuracy, and the voiding of a survey on the basis of later criminal conduct by the surveyor, when that conduct did not affect the survey itself, was an overreach that the applicable law did not support. The Bell claim was reinstated. Clegg, who was a small man who had been vibrating with contained energy for 2 days, permitted himself a quiet exhalation that was as close to celebration as a lawyer in a courthouse allows himself. Martha was very still beside Seth. He looked at her and saw that her eyes were bright and that she was breathing carefully. "Are you all right?" he said softly. "Yes," she said. "I am very all right." She paused. "It doesn't change anything practically, I know that. The land is ours regardless. It changes what happened to you and Douglas," Seth said. "It says it was wrong." She nodded once. "That matters," she said. "That is what I wanted. For the record to be straight." He took her hand in the empty courthouse after the others had filed out, and they sat for a moment in the quiet of it, and then she squeezed his hand and stood up and said, "Let's go home," in the voice of someone who means every word of it. They rode home to the valley in the October light, which was extraordinary. The cottonwoods turned gold, and the red stone glowing, and the sky infinite and clear, and the creek running bright below the golden trees, and the house looking solid and settled in the meadow, as if it had been there forever rather than less than 3 years. November passed in a deep quietness and a steady readiness. The nights were cold now, and the days were short, and the mountains were white above the valley, and inside the house was warm and lit and full. Martha taught Seth how to knit, which he was terrible at, and he taught her how to play 3 chords on the harmonica, which she was significantly better at than the knitting, and they sat by the stove in the evenings and read aloud to each other, which was something Martha had done with Douglas and had missed enormously, and which Seth discovered he liked tremendously, not only for the books themselves but for her voice reading them. She read well. She had clearly done it all her life. Letters came from Clara asking for constant updates and expressing an intention to arrive the moment she received word, and from Roberto Chavez's wife, a warm woman named Elena who had become something of a friend to Martha over the year, and from Clegg with the final paperwork formalizing the reinstatement of the Bell claim and incorporating it into the existing title. January arrived with a week of snow and then a clearing, and James Douglas Ellsworth arrived on the 17th of January, 1885, on a cold, clear morning when the valley was white and still, and the mountains were sharp as cut glass against the blue sky. He was named James for no particular family reason except that they both liked the name, and Douglas for Martha's first husband, which had been Martha's suggestion, and which Seth had agreed to without hesitation, because Douglas Bell had loved this valley and had brought Martha to it and had, in his way, made everything that followed possible. He was a healthy baby and a loud one, and he looked, when Seth first held him in his hands in the new morning light streaming through the window, entirely and completely like a person who intended to be here, which Seth found more moving than he had words for. "Hello," he said to the baby, feeling somewhat foolish and not caring. James Douglas Ellsworth looked at him with the unfocused attentiveness of very new infants and apparently found him satisfactory. Clara arrived 3 weeks later, having ridden through January whether that Seth would not have risked himself, and stood in the doorway of the house with snow on her coat and looked at her nephew with an expression that was entirely her own, sharp and soft at once. "He looks like you," she told Seth. "Poor child." "He has Martha's eyes," Seth said. "Thank goodness for that," Clara said, and went and sat beside Martha and held the baby with the ease of someone who knows what they are doing, and Martha watched her with the particular expression she had when she was content. Clara stayed a month, which was longer than planned because the weather was poor, and because she was clearly in no hurry to leave, and the four of them in the small house were good company for each other, and James was an endlessly interesting subject of observation and discussion. The spring came early that year in March, with warm winds from the south that melted the snow fast and sent the creek running high and strong. Seth walked out to the ridge on the first warm day and stood there looking at the valley coming to life below him, the grass beginning to green at the creek banks, the cottonwoods budding, the red stone bright in the March light, and Cannonball standing in the corral below with his face into the sun. He had spent 10 years looking for this place, riding the territory of the American West in what now felt like an enormous half-aware spiral converging on this particular valley in New Mexico, on this creek and this ridge and this dark soil. He had been looking for land, which was true, but it was also incomplete because what he had found was a life, and a life had turned out to be considerably more than land. He had found Martha, who would not move from the ground where she had planted herself, and who had been right not to move, and who had stood her ground with a steadiness and a courage that he would spend his life being grateful to witness. He walked down to the house. The door was open to let in the first warm air of the year, and through it he could hear Martha talking to James, who was 2 months old and too young to understand words but not too young to like the sound of her voice, which was reasonable, Seth thought, because he had never gotten tired of it either. He came through the door and she was standing by the window with the baby, the morning light falling across her and across James, who was looking at the window with the extraordinary focused attention of someone encountering light for the first time. And Martha looked up when Seth came in and smiled, not the almost smile of their early weeks but the full open smile that he had earned gradually and carefully, and that was, he thought, the best thing in his world. "How is the ridge?" she asked. "The grass is coming in early along the creek," he said. "Another week, maybe less." "I want to plant in 2 weeks," she said. "The soil is ready." 2 weeks, he agreed. She looked at him with that direct, honest gaze. "Are you happy, Seth?" He came across the room and stood beside her and looked at the baby and at her and at the light on them both, and at the window behind them framing the valley and the mountains, and he thought about the question, which deserved a real answer. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said, "by a considerable distance." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just briefly, with the baby between them, and outside the creek ran and the cottonwoods were budding, and the mountains were blue and white, and the valley was filling up with spring. And it was exactly right. It was exactly the place and the life and the moment. And Seth Ellsworth, who had spent 10 years looking, was not looking anymore. The years settled on the valley like the slow accumulation of good things, each one laying down its particular richness on top of what had come before. The cattle herd grew steadily, from 8 to 20 to 35 head over 5 years, quality beef cattle that had a reputation in the county for soundness and good temperament, because Martha insisted on choosing the bulls carefully and Seth agreed with her. The garden expanded too, not because they needed it to, but because Martha loved it, loved the work of it and the abundance of it, and the yearly miracle of putting seeds into dark soil and watching the earth respond. She started the lending library in the spring of James's first birthday. It began with 47 books collected from their own shelves, from donations solicited through letters to Clara, and to every person they knew who might have books to spare, and from 2 substantial purchases Seth made from a bookseller in Santa Fe without telling Martha, and then presented to her on the morning of the library's first day, which he had organized as a kind of occasion, with 3 other families from the valley in attendance. Martha had stood in front of the boxes of books with an expression that he had not seen on her face before, something that was wonder and gratitude combined, and she had looked at him, and he had said, "For the record," which meant nothing to anyone else present and everything to her, and she had crossed the yard and kissed him in front of the Chavez family and the 2 other Homestead families and James, who was perched on Alina Chavez's hip and watching everything with great interest. And nobody seemed to mind at all. The library grew. By the end of the 2nd year, it had over 150 volumes and was serving 11 families in the surrounding valley, and Martha organized it with the focused attention she brought to everything, keeping a careful record of who had what and when it was expected back. The Chavez children were her most enthusiastic borrowers, and their oldest daughter, Anna, who was 12, had developed an appetite for reading that Martha nurtured with particular attention, recommending books and discussing them with her when she brought them back. "That child could do anything she sets her mind to," Martha told Seth one evening about Anna. "She thinks very clearly. Someone should tell her so regularly until she believes it." "Someone is telling her," Seth said, watching his wife's face. "Someone is trying," Martha said, with the slight self-deprecating precision that was her particular form of modesty. Their 2nd child came in March of 1888, a girl they named Ruth Clara, Ruth because Martha loved the name and Clara for Seth's sister, who received this news by letter and wrote back a response that was unusually brief because, as she explained in a follow-up letter, she had been unable to write coherently for 2 days after hearing it. Ruth was quite different from James. Where James had been vocal and demanding and interested in everything from the beginning, Ruth was observant and quiet, watching the world with enormous dark eyes that were Martha's exactly, cataloging everything with a thoroughness that Seth found both slightly unnerving and deeply familiar. "She is going to know more than either of us by the time she can talk," he told Martha. "She already does," Martha said comfortably. James, at 3, received his sister with a proprietary interest that was occasionally expressed as helpfulness, and occasionally as an excessive desire to show her things she was not yet capable of appreciating. And Martha managed this with the patient precision of someone who was born to be a mother, which Seth had known from early on and had been proved correct about repeatedly. Cannonball, old and slow and more interested in grass than anything else, lived to see Ruth's first birthday and died that spring quietly in the corral, which hit Seth harder than he had expected, because the horse had been his companion for most of his adult life and had carried him through 10 years of looking and finally down the slope into this valley, and there was something in the loss of him that was the closing of a chapter. Seth buried him at the edge of the meadow near the creek, which was the most beautiful spot on the property, and said so out loud, and felt no embarrassment about saying it. He got a new horse the following spring, a black gelding James immediately named Thunder in the way of small boys, and the name stuck entirely against Seth's intentions. Thunder was younger and faster and less wise than Cannonball and required more management, but he was a good horse, honest and willing, and Seth grew fond of him. The spring of 1889 brought a letter from the territorial government that was significant. New Mexico Territory was in discussions about statehood. It would not come immediately, the letter indicated. It would not come until 1912, as it turned out, though no one knew that yet. But the discussions were beginning, and the land laws were being reviewed and consolidated, and the Ellsworth joint title that Clegg had put together was solid and would stand whatever review came. Clegg himself had moved to Santa Fe by this point, and had become a person of some significance in territorial law, and he wrote to Martha occasionally with news of cases that he thought would interest her, and she wrote back with the same careful intelligence she brought to everything. And Seth had suggested more than once that she had missed her calling as a lawyer, which she received with the small smile and the slight shake of her head that meant she was pleased but not going to admit it. Roberto Chavez died in the autumn of 1889, peacefully, in his own bed on his own land, which was the right way for a man like that to go. Alina stayed on the land with her sons, and the Chavez family remained the Ellsworth family's nearest and best neighbors. And Ana Chavez, now 18, had begun corresponding with a teaching college in Santa Fe about the possibility of enrollment, which Martha had helped her do, and which Seth had helped fund in a quiet way that he had not told Martha about because he suspected she was doing the same thing. When they discovered they had both been contributing to Anna's education independently, the discovery happened at the Chavez dinner table during a Sunday visit, and Alina Chavez, who had known both things and had maintained a diplomatic silence about each to the other, laughed until she had to set down her fork. "You are," Alina said, "exactly the same person." Seth and Martha looked at each other across the Chavez table, and the look that passed between them was the kind that two people exchange when they have been together long enough that a look contains everything a long conversation would. "We are not the same," Martha said. "We are not," Seth agreed. "We are merely," Martha said, "sometimes going in the same direction without knowing it." "Which is," Seth said, "a reasonable definition of marriage." Alina laughed again, and the Chavez children laughed, and James, who was 5 and sitting between his parents, looked from one to the other with the expression of a child who knows something is funny without knowing why, and Ruth, in Martha's lap, continued to observe everything with her quiet, encyclopedic attention. The decade turned, and the years continued their good work. James grew up tall and quiet and strong, with his father's deliberateness and his mother's precision. And he had, from very young, the particular relationship with the land that Seth recognized as the real thing, not just knowing land but understanding it, feeling it, which was not something that could be taught. He was his father's constant companion on the ranch as soon as he was old enough, learning everything there was to learn about the cattle and the fence lines, and the irrigation work Seth had been doing along the creek to improve the summer pastures. Ruth grew up into the enormous dark eyes and the thorough observing mind, and she read everything in the lending library by the time she was 12, and Martha had to write to Santa Fe for new books regularly to keep up with her, and she talked about everything she read with a clarity and an insistence on precision that made Seth think regularly of his wife at that age, though they were quite different in other ways. A third child came in 1892, another boy, named Thomas, who arrived in the April of his birth like the season he was born in, noisy and energetic and immediately interested in everything, and who was so different from both James and Ruth that Seth and Martha spent considerable time in his early years looking at him, with the affectionate bafflement of parents discovering that their children are not extensions of themselves. Thomas was, from the beginning, his mother's particular delight, because he argued with her about everything in the good faith way she valued most, and she argued back with equal enjoyment. And Seth watched these exchanges across the supper table, and thought that Martha Bell Ellsworth was the most completely herself in argument, which was perhaps true of everyone. The valley had changed over the decade, not in its essential character, but in the ways that all things change with care and time and intention. The house was larger now, properly so, with the second room long finished and a third added when Thomas was born. A real front porch that Seth had built one spring over Martha's initial protest that it was an unnecessary luxury and her eventual admission, first expressed sitting on it in the evening watching the mountains, that it was not a luxury at all. The garden was magnificent. Martha had extended it over the years and diversified it, and in July it was an extraordinary thing, the kind of garden that travelers who happened by would stop and stare at, which occasionally they did, and Martha would not quite accept compliments but would offer them seeds for next spring with the specificity of someone who takes the subject seriously. The lending library had outgrown the house shelf and now occupied a proper dedicated cabinet in the new room, which was partly Seth's study and partly the library depending on the day, and had nearly 300 volumes, and served 20 families, and 2 of those families had children who were now old enough to be using the books for independent study they had organized themselves, which Martha considered the best possible outcome. Ana Chavez had indeed gone to the teaching college in Santa Fe, had returned 2 years later, and was now teaching in Cimarron at the school there. She came to visit the Ellsworth Valley regularly, and her visits were occasions, with the whole family at the table and the best food and long conversations that ranged widely and were good for everyone. On a September evening in 1895, when James was 10 and Ruth was 7, and Thomas was 3 and Seth was 44 and Martha was 38, they sat on the front porch after supper in the long, cool dusk, which was the best time in September, and the children were somewhere in the meadow doing whatever it was children did in meadows, and the creek was quiet below, and the mountains were purple and gold. Martha had a book open on her lap but was not reading it. "What are you thinking about?" Seth asked her from the other chair. She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about the first day you came," she said, "when you rode down from the ridge and came to the garden." He looked at her. "I was thinking about that recently too. I was very frightened," she said. "I did not let it show, but I was frightened. A man with legal papers and I was alone and everything Douglas and I had built here was in the balance." "You didn't look frightened," Seth said. "You looked like someone who had decided what she was going to do and was doing it." "That is generally what frightened people look like when they are not going to let the fear run them," Martha said. She turned her head and looked at him with those dark eyes in the fading light, and she was 38, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes and her hair was not entirely dark anymore, and she was the most beautiful woman he had ever known, and he had thought that since roughly the second month of knowing her, and had told her so on enough occasions that she had mostly stopped arguing with him about it. "I am glad you stayed," she said. "I stopped looking," Seth said. "The moment I talked to you for 10 minutes, I think, before I even knew what I had found." "And what had you found?" she asked, with the slight deliberateness of someone who wants to hear the specific answer. "Everything," he said. "That is the honest and complete answer. Everything I had been looking for and several things I had not known to look for." She looked at him for a moment with that open, unguarded expression that he had first seen in the creek all those years ago. "That is a very good answer," she said. "I had a long time to work it out," he said. She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand on his arm, and they sat together in the September dusk on the porch he had built for her on the land they had made together. And below them the valley was deep gold and green in the last light, and the creek was silver, and the mountains were turning dark, and the children came running up from the meadow with the noise of children who have been playing hard, James leading and Ruth behind him and Thomas on his short legs doing his best to keep up. And they came tumbling onto the porch, and James said there was an owl in the cottonwoods and could they go look. And Martha said it would be dark soon, but there was time. And Seth said he'd come too, and they went down from the porch together into the meadow in the last of the September light, the five of them, in the valley that had been found and fought for and built up and made into something good. And the owl was there in the cottonwoods, exactly where James said it would be, watching them all with its ancient, unconcerned golden eyes, and the creek ran on, and the mountains held the sky. And Seth Ellsworth looked at his wife looking up at the owl with the silver light of early stars coming into the meadow, and thought, this is the place, this has always been the place, and now I will never need to look again.